Afternoon, Professor An- Antonio Cutelo.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, can hear you
Oh,
well. All right. So let's wait for some minutes to get some audience and we'll get started.
okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are about to start with the final concurrent session of Research in Action 2025. Um, so I'm gonna make Dr. Cutelo co-host so you can share your screen. Um, all right. So allow me to introduce our presenter. Um, so the name of this presentation is First Language, Second Language, Foreign Language Triangulation in Teaching English to the deaf, uh, yeah. So this is by Professor Antonio Henrique Cutelo de Moraes, PhD, from the Federal University of Rondonópolis, Federal University of Mato Grosso. Antonio Henrique Cutelo de Moraes holds a postdoctorate in language studies from the Federal University of Mato Grosso and a PhD and Master's in Language Sciences from the Catholic University of Pernambuco. He also earned a Portuguese and English languages degree. He holds a pedagogy degree from the International University Center He is a professor in the English language program at the Federal University of Rondonópolis and lectures in postgraduate programs at the Federal University of Rondonópolis, the Catholic University of Pernambuco, and the Federal University of Mato Grosso. His expertise includes teaching and mother foreign languages, focusing on inclusion, foreign language acquisition, and teaching, English education deftness, and intersections among these fields. So welcome, Doctor, and the room is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. All right. So good afternoon. I'm truly honored to be here today at the 23rd Research in Action Conference hosted by UNICA. My name is Antonio Henrique Coutelo de Moraes, and I'm a professor at both the Federal University of Rondonópolis and the Federal University of Mato Grosso. And the presentation I bring to you today is titled First Language, Second Language, and Foreign Language Triangulation in English Language Teaching to the Deaf. And this research is grounded on my academic experience in inclusive education and language teaching, and it aims to discuss how a trilingual approach can reshape English language education for deaf learners in Brazil. It branches from discussions and research within the study and research group on language, inclusion, and teaching. This group brings together undergraduate students, postgraduate researchers from public and private institutions, and organized civil society with the purpose of debating issues related to language and inclusion in all its meanings and in its various manifestations, in dialogue with various other areas of linguistics and social and human sciences. The group is therefore characterized by the development of inter-trans or multidisciplinary research, characteristics of language studies. The foreign language education for deaf individuals has historically been overlooked or even intentionally excluded. However, with the increasing recognition of linguistic human rights and inclusive pedagogies, this area is now gaining more academic attention. This presentation stems from a research project that explores how we can promote English language learning for deaf students by leveraging 3 languages simultaneously. Brazilian Sign Language, which we call Libras as their first language, Portuguese, which functions as a second language, and English, introduced as a foreign language. This triangulation respects the linguistic reality of deaf students in Brazil. It is not about replacing one language with another, but rather about integrating and mediating through them to foster access and meaningful learning. Let's begin by identifying the problem that motivated this research. Traditional educational paradigms often operate on a monolingual, auditory-centric model that inherently excludes deaf students from foreign language learning. There is a common misconception that learning English, a phonocentric and predominantly written or spoken language, would be too difficult or even unnecessary for deaf students. Such assumptions marginalize deaf students and ignore their cognitive and linguistic capabilities. They also deny access to global communication, academic resources, and professional opportunities that English might provide. This study, therefore, proposes a paradigm that recognizes a multilingual approach with multilingual identities of deaf students and uses that as a basis for pedagogical innovation. This study is guided by 3 core research questions that shape both the theoretical and practical dimensions of this presentation. First question is, how does linguistic triangulation impact English as a foreign language learning for deaf students? Here, I'm interested in understanding whether and how the use of Brazilian Sign Language and Portuguese in combination can facilitate English learning, particularly in terms of comprehension, retention, and participation. Second question is, what are the perceptions of teachers and interpreters on classroom practices involving this approach? Their insights are essential since they are the agents who implement, adapt, and mediate educational practices daily. And lastly, what inclusive methodologies can be adopted in order to support this triangulation in practical terms? This question focuses on the tools, strategies, and frameworks we can rely on to build a more inclusive classroom for deaf students. Based on the previous questions, the research sets out both general and specific objectives. The general objective is to reflect critically on the potential of a triangulated linguistic model in teaching English to deaf students. And as specific objectives, there are first to explore theoretical perspectives from linguistics, deaf studies, and education that support this model. Second, to analyze recent findings from both research and practice in inclusive language teaching. And third, to understand and document pedagogical practices that are already in use or could be adapted for inclusive multilingual contexts. Together, these objectives help us map both the theoretical foundation and the practical implications of the triangulation model. The theoretical framework for this study is interdisciplinary, drawing from three main areas. First, I refer to bilingual and multilingual education theory. Grosjean's rejection of the monolingual standard reminds us that bilinguals, deaf or hearing, are not two monolinguals in one. They use their full linguistic repertoire dynamically. Second, I refer to sociocultural learning theory, especially the works of Vygotsky and Dewey. Vygotsky's concept of the zone of proximal development supports the idea that language learning happens through mediated, scaffolded interactions, something central when teaching deaf learners through interpreters of visual tools. Dewey's emphasis on reflection and experience aligns with student-centered, inquiry-based education. And Stephen May's notion of the multilingual turn in language education also calls for a move away from traditional linear models of language acquisition, especially in diverse contexts. And third, I draw from deaf studies, particularly the recognition of sign languages as full complex languages with their own grammars, structures, and discursive practices, as emphasized by Stokoe and Liddell. Together, these frameworks help us rethink English language teaching in light of linguistic diversity, visual learning, and cultural inclusion. So the three researchers I mentioned throughout this presentation regarding deaf education are Moraes and Almeida. Actually, Almeida is watching us at this very moment, and he is someone who's been researching with me about the teaching of English to deaf students. The literature reviewed supports the use of visual, bilingual, and multimodal strategies in teaching English to deaf students. Authors such as Paiva and Souza have shown that bilingual education, including both Brazilian Sign Language and Portuguese, is essential for deaf students' academic success. Petito and colleagues emphasize how exposure to multiple languages, including sign language, enhances cognitive flexibility and metalinguistic awareness. And Garcia and Tyler advocate for visual learning strategies, including images, gestures, and written forms, which can facilitate access to meaning in English as a foreign language contexts. These studies form a solid foundation for applying triangulated language models that treat deaf students as bilingual or multilingual learners, not as language impaired. This is a qualitative study using both bibliographic and descriptive observational research methods. I followed the methodological approaches proposed by Trevinius and Bardin. The data collected include semi-structured interviews with English as a foreign language teachers and Brazilian Sign Language interpreters, classroom observations in bilingual or inclusive settings. These methods allowed me to explore both subjective experiences and observable practices, providing a holistic view of the educational context. The pedagogical intervention I propose is built around 4 key strategies, all grounded in theory and supported by practice. The first one would be pre-teaching in Libras or Brazilian Sign Language before engaging with English texts or content. Key concepts are introduced and discussed in Brazilian Sign Language. This gives students a cognitive map and makes learning more accessible. For the second moment, scaffolding. Learning activities are structured progressively from simpler to more complex, allowing students to build knowledge step by step, supported by their linguistic repertoire. Third, pre, while, and post reading and writing activities. And these activities are divided into 3 stages: before, during, and after a task to help students activate prior knowledge, process new input, and reflect on their learning. And lastly, reflective thinking. Teachers and students are encouraged to reflect on the learning process, what worked, what didn't work, and how the use of different languages helped hinder understanding. I used Bardin's content analysis to analyze the qualitative data after coding the transcripts and filing notes. I identified 3 main themes: language interaction, how students switch between Brazilian Sign Language, Portuguese, and English, and how that helps or complicates learning. Interpreter roles, and then interpreters are not passive translators. They are pedagogical agents, often mediating content, adjusting pace, and clarifying concepts. And lastly, teacher strategies. Teachers who adapt their materials visually and included Brazilian Sign Language in their lessons planning reported better student engagement and better understanding. The main findings can be summarized as follows. Brazilian Sign Language is essential to students' understanding and learning processes. It activates cognition and makes abstract concepts more accessible. Portuguese serves as a bridge language. While it is not the first language for most deaf students, it helps them navigate written English and provides a point of reference. Number 3, English acquisition improves when teachers use multimodal strategies, images, gestures, videos, captions, and when lessons are mediated by sign language. And number 4, collaboration is key. Teachers and interpreters reported that working together from the planning phase leads to more coherent and inclusive lessons. They do not see themselves as working in parallel, but as co-educators. In conclusion, a triangulated linguistic model is not just innovative, it is necessary. It promotes educational equity, respects deaf students' linguistic identities, and fosters learning in a way that is both inclusive and effective. This approach challenges our base assumptions, repositions sign language as a legitimate instructional tool, and contributes to culturally responsive pedagogy. Rather than seeing deafness as a barrier, it reframes linguistic diversity as a resource. Based on the results, I propose an action plan with 4 main priorities: teacher training, preparing educators to use bilingual and multilingual methods; curriculum development to integrate deaf culture and linguistic rights into school curricula; material production to create visual and accessible learning materials that can be used in trilingual context, and interpreter-teacher collaboration to foster collaborative planning and decision making between teachers and interpreters so that classes are more inclusive and pedagogically sound. These are the references to the research.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cutelo, for this enlightening presentation. So I would like to ask the audience to type any question you may have for our presenter. And in the meantime, we have some questions for you. Um,
Okay.
our first question is, how do you envision the role of translanguaging evolving in future inclusive EFL classrooms, especially with the dynamic interaction among Libras, Portuguese, and English?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yes. How do you envision the role of translanguaging evolving in future inclusive EFL classrooms, especially with the dynamic interaction that there is among Libras language, Portuguese, and English? What can we expect in terms of
Uh-huh.
translanguaging?
Um, it is actually very important. As Mateus mentioned earlier, students and deaf students, they tend to use the three languages anyway. Firstly, because their natural language would be the sign language, would be Libras, and the country language is Portuguese, and this is the language that circulates all spaces of schools. And they've also already had the experience with the Portuguese language when they start learning the English language. So they usually try and approximate languages when they're learning the English language. So whenever they do not know a word in English, the closest language to them would be Portuguese. So they tend to use Portuguese. So these languages already circulate in the classroom. So these translingual practices are actually very, how can I say, powerful to classroom and to language teaching.
Thank you, Professor. We have a question from the audience.
Uh-huh.
Lu Lucinea Macedo is asking, congrats for your presentation. What are the challenges for teaching and learning English for deaf students in inclusive context with hearing students?
There are challenges for teachers, for students, and for colleagues. But when you think about this context, we're usually talking about multilingual classes with people with and without any disabilities. So when we're working on speaking activities and oral activities in general, when the students have to listen or to speak, most, especially in Brazil, most deaf students, uh, they have a deep loss of hearing, so they do not participate in these moments. They usually do not speak because they can't hear. So for these contexts, we usually face difficulties in maybe managing students in the classroom, because while we need to work on speaking and listening with hearing students, we need to find something else we could do with deaf students, because they would not be able to participate in these activities. So we would need to work on reading and writing with these students. So this actually asks a lot from teachers, because we need to be prepared and we need to plan in advance so we can maybe work with these students on the same text, but for the hearing students, it could be in oral modality, and for the deaf students, the written modality, and then we can do one correction or one feedback only, because then they would have worked on the same material but in different modalities.
Thank you, Professor. In that sense,
Thank you.
I have a personal question that comes to my mind, and is
Uh-huh.
when we have like these interactions among hearing students and deaf students, what have been those reactions that the hearing students have towards them, and how can we foster like some more empathetic interaction, or what activities can we do to so that those hearing students like get more involved with the deaf students?
That's a good question. I've been thinking about this lately, and this is something that we need to research more on. But my first thoughts would be that we can try and integrate students or involve students rather in writing communicative activities. For example, they can exchange experiences and information about themselves, about the world, through the written form of the English language. So we can have situations that mimic or even real situations on platforms and social media that we use at present, so they can interact and exchange information. This is very important. And also, we believe that schools should be teaching sign language to the hearing students so that we promote inclusion.
Thank you. Um,
Thank you.
well, we have one more question,
Okay.
our last question, and it like you mentioned the importance of culturally responsive curricula. So could you share with us some examples of some kind of content or practices that may affirm deaf identity in the EFL classroom?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Uh, are there like
Huh.
activities or practices that may affirm like deaf identity in the classroom, like considering the fact that you have mentioned the importance of culturally responsive curricula? So what are
Uh-huh.
those contents that we can have, or practices that affirm deaf identity in the EFL classroom?
Okay, mainly activities and strategies, classroom practices that recognize and honor these students' cultural backgrounds and experiences and identities, which probably aim to make learning more inclusive. For example, activities which could incorporate key vocabulary in these students' home languages or in Brazilian Sign Language, storytelling across these cultures in the classroom so students can share experiences and cultural uh, backgrounds on their languages. So have students share traditional stories from their cultures and groups, compare maybe their narrative structures, and well, especially considering deaf culture, I would say introduce successful individuals who are deaf from diverse backgrounds, artists, scientists, use videos in sign language or bilingual materials so that we can have these elements of culture in the classroom.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was a very interesting
Thank you.
presentation. Um, From Unica, we want to thank you for being here, and to all the presenters and this research that you have been carrying on with deaf students. That's something very enlightening for us in our own practices of inclusive education. Um, so, because of time constraints, we will stop here. Thank you, Professor. And I would like to invite
Thank
the
you.
audience to join our YouTube channel, 3:45 Colombian hour, as we will have the final words of the event. Thank you very much for attending this presentation.